here with Ryan Daly from our European Research and Strategy team and Jen Wichmann from our North American Research team. They are the authors of our new ISA briefing note on the implications of changes in rental regulations. Ryan, why does it make sense to be revisiting this topic today?
Well, history has shown that during periods of recession or macroeconomic uncertainty, has often led to further regulation of the residential sector. We saw it in the aftermath of the GFC, and we're certainly seeing it during this period post-COVID lockdowns and during this period of high inflation. Politicians view rent control and regulations as a means to control increased costs for the citizens and their voters. And with inflation running at double-digit levels across much of Europe since the middle of last year and the invasion of Ukraine, renters and household finances have become increasingly stretched. And so policies which aim to reduce those costs for citizens and for households are understandably going to be extremely popular with voters and with the politicians that will be enacting them. Often, though, regulations come with some unintended consequences, which we touch on in the note. And the most pressing of which really is the uncertainty of new regulations when they're brought in. That can in turn deter investment into residential property, which exacerbates the main driver of high rent growth, which is undersupply of housing generally. And there have been a number of examples that we can highlight, which we do in the note, of new regulations which have been brought in over the last year or so. Many of these are supposedly temporary. They include in Denmark, where typically leases are linked to an index of inflation. There, the government has put a cap on all rent increases of CPI plus or CPI inflation plus 1%. A more extreme example has been seen in Scotland, where the government there introduced a complete freeze on rent increases for in-place rents. So landlords couldn't increase rents on their tenants at all for 6 months. That ended in April of this year, where from now on it will be just 3%.
So regulations come in many shapes and sizes, from those really constraining caps or something very strict like what you mentioned in Scotland, or something that's less constraining, less severe. Some are only controls for in-place tenants, and some also include new leases as well. So as ever, the devil is in the details. Jen, there's also been some new regulations in some parts of the U.S. Where do those sit on that spectrum of how tight they are?
Yeah, so we saw prior to COVID, two new statewide regulations go into effect in California and Oregon, and those are fairly relaxed. They have fairly high caps. They only apply to new leases. They don't apply to newer construction buildings. So those you would really only see, owners running into hitting those caps in really high run-up periods. But we have seen some more stringent examples come into place as well. In St. Paul, Minnesota, for example, they enacted a 3% cap on all leases, new leases and renewals, all buildings, regardless of age. And that ended up getting rolled back. It had a pretty fast chilling effect on development in the city, and they've increased those caps quite substantially. And we've also seen moves in the exact opposite direction. Very recently, Florida enacted an outright ban on rent control in that state, and there are other states that are moving in that direction as well.
So it sounds like the picture is a little less severe than in some parts of Europe where these changes have come in. Ryan, how should investors think about rent controls, and what can they do to mitigate the impact of those controls and changes in those controls on their investment returns?
Well, rent controls and rent regulations are very much part of the landscape in Europe and always have been. The phrase that we often use at LaSalle is a feature, not a bug. And one of the aspects of them is that they can often help drive lower volatility in income. Typically, more regulated markets see lower vacancy, longer average length of stay for tenants, and what that translates to is low but stable and reliable cash flow growth. And these are features which can be highly attractive to investors, particularly in a low inflation environment, which is something hopefully we return to in the coming years. So stable regulations are therefore priced into residential real estate in Europe. Investors work around them and factor them into their underwritings and their business plans all the time. The true risk really comes around when that regulatory environment changes and changes unexpectedly. And that's something that investors such as ourselves have to be extremely vigilant of. Assessing the political mood and the likeliness and timing of new regulations is extremely difficult, but nonetheless is something that's extremely necessary when screening potential deals in the residential sector in Europe. There are a few aspects or a few things that real estate investors can look to do to mitigate some of that risk. One of the things that we highlight in the note is perhaps diversifying across markets where there are different varying regimes, so that any one change in the environment doesn't have a major impact on your portfolio. We also suggest that investors would consider taking a appropriate risk premium in pricing for any deal that they're looking at in the sector, and making sure that they are adequately compensated for taking on the risk that the environment could change during the lifetime of their investment. And one final recommendation that we would have is that perhaps investors could look towards other living sectors that act as a proxy for the residential sector in Europe. This can include service apartments or student housing. They benefit from many of the same structural drivers as residential, but come with a much less regulatory risk, in our opinion.
Thanks, Ryan. Those are that's some helpful guidance. Regulation is here to stay, and it will change. It could loosen, it could tighten, usually mainly tightens. I'm here in Toronto today, where I'm going to see some of our assets that are subject to Ontario's form of rent control, which impacts most of the stock that's not brand new and sitting tenant, the increases for sitting tenants. So just a lot of diversity, and investors really need to understand the detail and heed some of those portfolio construction suggestions on how to be sure they're diversified. Jen, Ryan, thanks for joining me today and discussing your recent note.